Here's what's coming up in episode 170, Lisa Morton.
The description of her activities as a necromancer are unbelievably gross. I mean, they outdo any modern extreme fiction. Pepper's Ghost was that classic thing that we all know now where you have the special mirror. It's the same device that's used in, for example, the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland to make it look like you're watching transparent ghosts. But with Helen Duncan, she was tested extensively on producing this ectoplasm. And the investigator was a famous paranormal expert named Harry Price. People predicted that Halloween would be devastated by 9/11, and it was not. It was actually bigger than ever that year.
Welcome to the Big Seance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Have you ever heard people talk about how you never want to depend on someone else's platform? For example, and I know this sounds ridiculous, but if you stay in touch with the Big Seance Podcast on Facebook or Twitter, what happens if those platforms shut down? Or what happens if you or I, for whatever reason, are kicked off of our social media platform? How would I reach you then? That's why I recommend that you make sure you're subscribed to this show wherever you listen. That way you don't have to go looking for the show. Each new episode will automatically be delivered to you when it's released. And now I have another way for us to stay connected, and that is to sign up for my new newsletter, because guess what? I've been working on a book, and this way I can send you details about that when I have them and give you occasional updates. And don't worry, it won't be another weekly newsletter thing. I mean, I haven't even written the first one yet, but this way, when I have something to announce, I can do that and you'll know. To sign up for my newsletter, you can either visit the link in the show notes or simply go to bigseance.com/newsletter. Let's pour the tea and get to my fun conversation here in the parlor with Lisa Morton. Lisa Morton is a screenwriter, author of nonfiction books, and award-winning prose writer whose work was described by the American Library Association's Reader's Advisory Guide to Horror as consistently dark, unsettling, and frightening. She is the author of 4 novels and 150 short stories, a 6-time winner of the Bram Stoker Awards, and a world-class Halloween expert. And I have to tell you, that reason alone is why I've wanted to interview her for years. But she co-edited with Leslie S. Klinger the anthology Ghost Stories, Classic Tales of Horror and Suspense. Forthcoming in 2020, coming up very soon, is the book that we're going to talk about today, Calling the Spirits, A History of Seances. And so you know this book is right up my alley. Lisa lives in Los Angeles, and her website is lisamorton.com. I want to read you the book description of Calling the Spirits. Calling the Spirits investigates the eerie history of our conversations with the dead, from necromancy in Homer's Odyssey to the emergence of spiritualism when Victorians were entranced by mediums and the seance was born. Among our cast are the Fox sisters, teenagers surrounded by spirit wrappings, Daniel Douglas Hume, the greatest medium of all time, Houdini, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, whose unlikely friendship was forged, then riven, by the afterlife, and Helen Duncan, the medium whose trial in 1944 for witchcraft proved more popular to the public than news about the war. The book also considers Ouija boards, modern psychics and paranormal investigations, and illustrated with engravings, fine art from beyond, and photographs. Hugely entertaining. It begs the question, is anybody there? That's a great book description. Welcome to my Seance parlor, Lisa. How are you?
I'm great, Patrick. Thanks for inviting me along.
Right before we started recording, we talked about the massiveness of Chapter 4 in your book. Chapter 4 is the Victorians and spiritualism and, the seance coming into play. And it's massive. It's like, I feel like it's probably the biggest chunk of your book, and it's so juicy. And so we're going to get there, but I want to spend a little bit of time before all of that and what led to what we know as spiritualism. And the first thing that really fascinated me in the first chapters were necromancy. And I hadn't read a lot about this, and I even had to refresh myself on the definition, honestly. And I had no idea that it was so gross.
Right.
But I think, that is right up your alley too, with the darkness and all of that. Tell us a little bit about what necromancy was.
Well, it was the magical part that, or the part of magic rather, that involves calling forth the dead. And it could take a couple of forms. It could be actually calling up a corpse, and sometimes the magician might have the corpse serve them. It could be calling forth a spirit. Again, quite often the magician would want the spirit to serve them in some way. And in the ancient world in particular, necromancy was often practiced for prophecy. There's a very famous story, which is, as you were mentioning, like the grossest thing ever written is the story of a witch called Erictho. And the son of Pompey the Great goes to this witch to find out how the battle is going to go. And she calls forth this spirit to give him the prophecy. The description of her activities as a necromancer are unbelievably gross. I mean, they outdo any modern extreme fiction. It's just incredible. It's this whole, right down to like eating babies' eyes and things. It's just, it really is crazy. Yeah, so that's one of the earliest descriptions, really, of a necromantic ritual. But then it goes forward, of course, into the Dark Ages, where you get into some really strange stuff, too. And the grimoires, the books of knowledge that were being passed around at that point, and ended up being forbidden, of course, by the Catholic Church and becoming these secret things. And we have some of those now, and there are people who still practice from those books. So it's a long and really strange history on necromancy. That's almost worth an entire other book.
Yeah. Could it have involved sacrifice? Like some of the grossness, was it like sacrifices, or is it just I found a dead body? And
yeah, sacrifices, if they were involved, they may have been involved, but they quite often would have been animals rather than people. I know certainly there is some indication that the ancient Celts practiced human sacrifice, but it probably wasn't for purposes of calling forth the dead. So yeah, there may have been sacrifice, but the things that they were doing anyways were so crazy and bizarre and gross, and sacrifice would almost have been even too much.
Yeah, if you're into gross, you will definitely love a few of those early chapters. I also find it fascinating, and I wish I could teleport myself or find a time machine to go back to some of the great light shows or some of the spook shows. I would love to be sitting in the audience of a light show and just see what it would have looked like, and to probably giggle a little bit at what would have made the audience feel like they were seeing, the afterlife, right in front of them, and ghosts and things.
Oh, yeah. If you get that time machine, make sure it seats 2, because I'm going to. Yeah, those were fascinating. They were called Phantasmagoria. They were these light shows using what they called a magic lantern, which was essentially an early slide projector. And the early shows, they were actually hand painting their own slides, and they would do things like even take 2 of the slides and move them against each other. So it looked like these projections were moving. They might move the projector backwards and forwards again to create the illusion of movement. And people were completely astonished by these things. They ran for years. The first of these were started in Paris. They ran forever in Paris. And in Paris, they actually were shown in an old chapel. So on top of the strangeness anyways of the Phantasmagoria, you're in this weird setting. I mean, it was apparently a somewhat ruined chapel that was kind of on the outskirts of the city. And then they became so popular, of course, that they moved over to first England and then to the US. And this was starting around the end of the 18th century. They ran through a little bit of the middle 19th century, and then they kind of died out. But they came back around the 1870s in the form of an illusion called Pepper's Ghost. And Pepper's Ghost was that classic thing that we all know now, where you have the special mirror. It's the same device that's used in, for example, the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland to make it look like you're watching transparent ghosts. And Pepper's Ghost kind of reinaugurated the whole interest in these traveling light and spook shows.
The first time I had ever heard of a spook show, I was in an antiques shop in my hometown that has kind of a Civil War battle town, little town in Missouri. And I saw what was a movie theater style poster for a spook show. And I forget what year it was from. I'm guessing it was like the 30s or 40s or something. Mm-hmm. And it was and I forget what the entertainer's name was, but I did a lot of reading at the time about it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I had no clue that these existed. So even though people were quick to figure out that this was mainly entertainment, but I had no idea how long spook shows would run. Like my grandpa could have been chilling with spook shows in my hometown,
I actually kind of wish I had covered the American 20th century spook shows a little bit more, because I love those. There's a wonderful book called Ghost Masters by I think it's Mark Walker, that covers the history of the ghost shows that ran here from around the late 30s up until the 60s. And they were interesting because they kind of sprang out of the Great Depression and magicians who were having a hard time making a living and so forth. And they started to put on these spook shows, and suddenly they were making a lot of money with these. So then more and more of the magicians turned to the spook shows, and they would travel with these things. And they traveled all over the country. They were, I think, maybe most popular, like where you're talking about, Missouri, the Midwest, the South. But they made it as far as the West Coast, and they were fascinating. Yeah, they were a combination of magic show and seance. They would usually start with the magician presenting maybe like 20, 30 minutes of a fairly traditional magic show, and then they would get into the spook show part of it. And the spook show part of it would often end with, they would suddenly douse the lights in the theater, and the magician would have assistants who had been hidden all over the sides and so forth of the theater, who would suddenly run through the audience with phosphorus covered sheets on fishing poles that they would run over people's heads. And of course, people would shriek. So yes, that's another one that I have always wanted to see. And I know there have been a few entertainment companies that have put on sort of modern versions of that, but a traditional one in a big movie house, I'm sure that would have been a knockout.
Oh. And I think you mentioned in the book that it was kind of a precursor of our horror flicks that we enjoy today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So every time I read a book about spiritualism, I read about the phenomena and I think that's so awesome. And then I tell myself, surely this medium was legit. And then I find out, of course, they were frauds. And then the book plays tricks on me again with another set of mediums, and I'm like, oh, please, these have to be real. And then, of course, they were frauds. And then I start wondering if I'm being duped in everything I'm passionate about in this field. It frustrates me. I'm like, oh, surely there is some body in history that was 100% real and authentic and wasn't trying to fool people. Do you have a feeling or idea of who you think might have been the truest medium during the time of spiritualism with actual abilities, or is it not that simple?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. Gosh, it's hard. I'm like you. I wanted to find one who was just, wow, how do you explain this? They must have been real. I couldn't come up with one. Spiritualism was such a puzzling movement in many ways. It's still around, but it has changed. It's much more of a sort of focused on healing, that kind of thing nowadays, and less on the sort of obsession with the seance and so forth. And it was puzzling because it was a religion that told its members that it could be proven scientifically. And that was a central tenet of 19th century spiritualism, that it could be proven scientifically. And yet, of course, every time it was investigated scientifically, it was disproven. And the spiritualists always had bizarre excuses for that. Oh, that was the one time the medium faked it, was a common one. And there are a few situations within the medium, within the spiritualist world that I thought were interesting. Hume, as you mentioned, Daniel Douglas Hume, DD, as he was called, it was the most famous of all of the mediums. And there were a few of his most famous feats that I still find somewhat puzzling. There was one that was called the Ashley House Levitation, and I think it was in 1872. And there were 3 witnesses in a room with him who claimed that they saw him levitate out an upper floor window and levitate back in through another window. And this is one of these things where hundreds of people have theorized about this since. It was very famous. It made all of the papers at the time because 2 of the witnesses were actual lords of the English aristocracy. So these were people who were taken quite seriously. And people are still trying to explain, well, I've been to the house, there's a ledge there, it's 18 inches wide, he could have done this, he could have done that. But the truth is that we weren't there. We don't know exactly how he did it or what these people saw. So that's a kind of an interesting one. That did he actually levitate? I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. We don't know for sure how he did it. If he did, if it was fakery, that's one of the more interesting ones. And the other one who I think is very interesting is the 20th century medium Helen Duncan, who you also mentioned up front in the description of the book. And what I find interesting about her, there are 2 things. One is that I think she, like many mediums, I think she was genuinely into the idea of helping people. And I think that is something that may have been the case with many of these mediums, that she genuinely liked the idea that she was conveying messages from supposed dead loved ones. And that provided a lot of comfort to some people. But with her, she was supposedly able to produce ectoplasm. And ectoplasm, of course, is this white filmy substance that would issue from a medium's mouth or nose. And it was supposed to be the sort of material of the spirits. Well, most often it was cheesecloth or the whites of eggs or paper. But with Helen Duncan, she was tested extensively on producing this ectoplasm. And the investigator was a famous paranormal expert named Harry Price. And Harry Price pronounced that she was regurgitating these materials at will, that she would swallow them before the examination, and then she would regurgitate at will. Now, what I find curious about that is he never explained how someone could regurgitate at will. I mean, I don't know about you, but there is no way I could regurgitate at will.
Surely there's nothing unhealthy about that.
Right. Well, and they did say that at one point during an examination of her, they noticed peculiar scarring on her throat. So it's entirely possible that that's all it was, that she had this uncanny ability to regurgitate at will. But again, like I said, even if that's the case, that seems like an extraordinary ability to me. That's almost as good as being able to call a spirit.
That makes me think of like our hot dog eating competitions and stuff. Like maybe they should be seen as paranormal if somebody can like consume that many hot dogs at a fair. Oh, I can't even watch those. I have often wondered why, and I've heard other people ask this too, and I've also heard interesting explanations from modern spiritualists, but why do we not focus on ectoplasm today? Why do we not focus on the physical phenomena that was so reported to have happened in the days of spiritualism? Why can't we produce those things now when we did then? And so it makes me wonder, like, is it just because we're smarter now and we have better ways of catching fraud, or just have we, I've heard people say that, well, we just don't need to impress people with those things now. And so that's why we don't have ectoplasm and all those things. Do you have an idea of why that was a then thing and not a now thing?
I do. And unfortunately, it's going to sound like a very cynical response.
Go for it.
It clearly dies out around the 1920s, and it dies out at the same time that organizations like the Society for Psychical Research are becoming much better at investigating these phenomena. And they consistently debunked every case of ectoplasm or levitations or table wrappings. And you see at about that time, the mediums switching over to something that cannot be easily tested, which is, I'm talking to the dead spirit of your uncle right now, and he's telling me he misses you and he loves you. That can't be debunked. You either take it on faith or you don't. So the mediums at that point all switch over to this because it, like I said, it can almost completely elude the investigations. Now, obviously, the investigator can say things like, if you're my Aunt Harriet, then you know when I was born. When was I born? But the mediums are good enough to dodge that usually too. So I think that's why we don't see the production of things like ectoplasm or table wrappings or whatever these days. Although one of the things that makes me laugh is obviously I love to watch some of the paranormal shows that are on now, the ghost hunting shows and so forth. And I actually have seen a couple where the table wrapping thing would happen, and it always makes me laugh because I know how it's being done. And it's one of those things that still mesmerizes people now. Whereas it fell out of favor for like 100 years. Now it seems like the most basic thing of table wrapping is back.
Yeah, I do have to say I am so not a medium or anything like that. And I don't investigate and do experiments as much as I used to. But I did a lot of EVP experimenting about 10 years ago. And I've written a lot about it on my blog. There were about 3 days in a row where I am fairly convinced that I was communicating with something that was rapping in my house, not like Tupac, but like up in the walls or the ceiling. And I can't explain it. And, no, I didn't get this wealth of information, but I did this. Your book talks about spirit telegraphy, which is the act of going through the alphabet to get a knock to get some kind of message. And for about 3 days, I did feel like I was really, I call them my rapper. And sometimes I miss my rapper because I'm like, man, that was a cool 3 days of sitting there getting legit, what felt like, you get used to like little knocks and taps and things in your home, and like when the pipes in the wall bang and when the shower runs, you're going to have some popping as pipes heat up and everything. But these were different, and I haven't had them since. And I still look back and wonder, what was that?
Right. Yeah.
And it's not like I was asking that day for knocks. I was just asking for EVP or for communication or whatever. And then all of a sudden they started happening, and then they were gone.
Interesting. Were you alone when you were recording these? Or?
I think most of the time I was alone. There may have been some cases where my husband was downstairs hiding because, first of all, I was always embarrassed to do these things when he was in the house, so I made him leave most of the time. I've totally gotten over most of that stuff now. He just will roll his eyes and move on. But most likely he was out of the house, but he may have been hiding.
I heard a great story about recording EVPs recently, and this actually came from, and I hope he won't mind that I share this, but this came from William Peter Blatty's son. And he told me that Dad obviously is one of the big proponents of EVP. I think he's one of the reasons it became so popular. Things like his book Legion and so forth, which is an absolutely great, very eerie book that deals a lot with recordings and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so his dad would take his recording equipment with him wherever he went. And one time he was staying in this sort of out of the way country motel. And he, for some reason, thought there might be a presence in the bathroom. So he set up his recording, and this was the old, like, reel-to-reel, this gigantic stuff at the time. He set up his recording equipment in the bathroom, and he starts saying, is there anyone there? Is there anyone there? And that's sort of classic EVP questions. So he heads back home after this trip, and he doesn't think apparently about this recording for a while. And then one day, Mike, his son, is visiting him, and he suddenly hears Dad screaming in the other room, oh my God, Mike, come in here. You have to listen to this. And so Mike goes running in and says, what, Dad? And so Bill Blatty plays him this EVP recorded in this out of the way motel. And he says, listen to this. I know you don't believe this stuff, but this is proof. Listen to these voices. So they're listening, and there are indeed voices on this recording. And finally, Mike says, can you turn that up? And so Blatty makes a few adjustments, and he turns it up, and they suddenly realize the voices are saying, do you hear something in the other bathroom? I hear some guy over there asking questions. And they realized there was someone staying in the room next to theirs. And they were hearing William Peter Blatty in the next room asking these questions, and were wondering what they were hearing. So that's pursuant to nothing except that I love telling that story. And I think it's an interesting way of how we can. EVPs are mysterious to me. I'm not sure I'm convinced one way or the other about them being real or not real. It seems like sometimes we hear what we want to hear in them. I've had friends who are paranormal investigators who will play me one, and they'll say, oh, listen to this. Here's a voice really clearly saying, get out of the house. And I hear it, and I hear, uh-huh. So, I would love to hear one that's completely convincing.
My opinions on EVP has grown and changed too. And I'm very critical of EVP, which is why I never, ever put out an EVP and say, this is an EVP. You know, it's like, who am I to say this is a spirit voice talking? You know, so I've always called them artifacts. But I can't tell you how many EVP I hear that I'm like, oh my gosh, how obvious is it that is something brushing across the table? Or how obvious is it that is, you know, someone's stomach growling, or someone, you know, just even breathing, you know, just the act of breathing or exhaling, or a wheeze, and people are like, oh my gosh, that says I'm from hell. And it's like, no, I'm pretty sure that's just somebody out of shape breathing heavy. So I go through all of those things too. And I even have some of my own EVP artifacts where after time has gone by, I listen to it again and I'm like, oh my God, that was totally, you know, my stomach rumbling, or that was, so I'm not settled on EVP either, even though it's like the biggest part of the paranormal probably that fascinates me.
Yeah. I'm also interested in the spirit box thing. And the closest I've ever had to my own interesting paranormal experience involved a spirit box. And it was kind of strange. It was, I was on an investigation in the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, which is a very famous haunted location. And we were in this old outbuilding that had been a concert hall, and it was like 3 a.m. And our paranormal investigator was using a spirit box. And these things, you know, just scan frequencies, and occasionally they blurt out a word. Most of the words mean nothing. At the time I was staying there, I was in the middle of writing my book, Ghost: A Haunted History. And I had, a few months earlier, had finished the section on the classical world. And I was in the middle of writing about hauntings in the more recent times. And so this spirit box at 3 a.m. in this supposedly very haunted outbuilding is going through its usual things, and you're hearing a lot of words that don't matter. And then suddenly it blurts out what sounds for all the world like Mostalaria, which is a very strange word. Mostalaria is the original name of a very famous play from Rome, which translates to the haunted house. And I had written extensively about Mostalaria in my section on classical hauntings. And it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm sure that's not what it really said, but that's what it sounded exactly like. And that is very strange. This was not something I had thought about in months because I had finished that section. So for this thing to blurt this out at 3 a.m. was really strange. And that's, to me, that's the closest I've had to something I really just was like, what the hell just happened? I've been on a number of paranormal investigations, and I haven't had yet anything else that I just couldn't explain.
I totally understand. Spirit boxes, I don't just ever sit down and do a basic EVP session with a recorder anymore. I've got to have more. Like I've got to have a spirit box with me or something because I just get too bored. But I'm totally, and the Estes method that people are trying now with the headphones and all that stuff, that's interesting. One of the coolest EVP that makes me think of what you were saying is there was a session where I was sitting at the Ouija board, and for years, and even now, nothing happens when I sit at a Ouija board. But I was doing an EVP session with the spirit box with my hands on the planchette of the Ouija board. And I asked, what am I touching? And so I'm assuming that if I got anything, I would have heard planchette. And I heard this, and I've talked about it on the podcast several times, but I have a recording of the spirit box responding with Ouija board. And it is so clear to me that the spirit box is Ouija board. And I'm like, when else would the radio randomly just spit out Ouija board, And right. I've also heard my name from a spirit box. And I think that could go into hearing what you want to hear. But right. That's when you hear your name from a spirit box too, that you don't just forget about that either. You're like, man,
Right. Yeah.
So let's get back into some of chapter 4, this amazingly delicious chapter. And one of the stories that has always fascinated me is William Crookes and Florence Cook and her, the spirit of Katie King, which I laughed every time you brought up the fact that another medium after that supposedly communicated with Katie King. Katie King was brought up so many times in the book from all these mediums. It was hilarious.
Oh, that's one of my favorite stories. Yeah, that's an absolutely incredible story on many levels. Florence Cook was a teenaged girl living with a sort of lower middle class family in London. She did her own autobiography at one point for one of the major spiritualist newspapers, and she claimed that she had demonstrated abilities early on, that furniture would fly around the home and so forth. And she took up fairly serious mediumship. I think it was around the early 1870s. And she, at one point, had a very wealthy sponsor named Charles Blackburn. He was an interesting figure in spiritualist circles, and he was actually paying her to give him these private sittings and so forth. And she was debunked in front of Blackburn at one point, and he withdrew his sponsorship of her. So she was kind of desperate to prove her abilities. And William Crookes was a very famous scientist at the time. He was involved in all kinds of famous scientific discoveries and so forth. He would end up being knighted in the early 20th century for his work as a scientist. But he was also an ardent spiritualist, and he had tested D.D. Home. And so because he had tested and verified the authenticity of Hume, which was a whole other story, Florence thought that she could go to him and undergo much the same testing, and he would verify her and she could get back her sponsor and so forth. Well, so this is where this takes a very strange left turn. Florence was very pretty. Crookes was a married man with 6 children. I think at the time that Florence entered their life, his wife was pregnant yet again. And Florence ends up living with them for 6 months to undergo these investigations. Later on, there are many witnesses who come forward and say that Florence told them that she had an affair with Crookes. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case. Crookes himself wrote extensively about their investigations in less than scientific terms at times. He would go on about her loveliness and she's this and she's that. And so it seems likely that they were having an affair right under his roof. And he did test her. He did end up saying she's completely for real. He tested her with things like he set up a galvanometer where she was sitting in a chair attached to electrical outlets. And if she lifted her hand from one of these circuits, it would break the circuit and so forth. And so he claimed that even while things were happening around her, that the circuit was never broken. The electricity never failed, et cetera, et cetera. But he also documented Florence was famed for making this full body spirit Katie King appear. She was the first. The Victorians were dying to have a full body apparition appear in front of them. And she was supposedly the first medium who really did that. And you look at it now, and it's so incredibly obvious that it's just her wearing a white sheet. You can see the face quite clearly in a number of the photographs, and it's very clearly Florence Cook. And what she would do was she would go they had a spirit cabinet. That was a big thing in these Victorian seances, where the medium at some point would go into the spirit cabinet. They may or may not be tied up inside the spirit cabinet. A little curtain would be pulled across it. And sometimes the spirit cabinet was nothing but another room, and they had just hung a curtain across the doorway. And within the spirit cabinet, strange sounds and so forth might happen, and then things would start to happen in the room. Well, usually, of course, the medium had just snuck out under cover of darkness and would make things happen in the room. She would actually go into the spirit cabinet, and she had hidden on her person this white sheet that she would put on in the spirit cabinet, and then she would emerge as Katie King. And of course, she would tell people, my medium is in the spirit cabinet in a trance. You can't disturb her or she could die. This apparently worked, although there was one case where someone actually did leap up in the middle of the seance, pull the curtain aside, and reveal that she was not in the cabinet. And so what Florence did after that was get a confederate to actually be in the cabinet, passed out. Another young girl who was fairly similar in size and appearance to her, but would lay face down so they couldn't see the face clearly. But William Crookes he made something like 46 photographs of Katie King. And in the most famous one, he is arm in arm with the spirit, parading around this somewhat darkened room and so forth. And it's so obviously, like I said, it's so obviously faked. And obviously, William Crookes would have been in on it, which is disappointing.
A little biased.
A little bit biased. Now, he later on destroyed these photographs, but some of them had been published, which is why we have any of these today. There is one that I use in my book. We had to settle on a pretty awful copy of it because there really are no great copies of these photographs anymore, but you can make it out pretty well. I opted for the one of him arm in arm with Katie King.
Still a great photograph.
It is an amazing photograph, even if you know it's just faked and so forth. It's incredible. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that I also think that part of the appeal of these spiritualist seances was an erotic element. Aside from the fact that Crookes is having this affair with this very pretty young girl, there's the element of you put yourself in the position of being at one of these seances. You're in a dark room. You're pressed closely around this table. And one of the things that the mediums would often do was remove their feet from their shoes and rub your leg, which, of course, they would say that's a spirit touching you. So there are a lot of these interesting elements in these things. Quite often, these pretty young mediums were searched before the seance. One of the people who was in attendance at many of Florence's seances was a fairly famous writer at the time named Florence Marriott. Florence Marriott even went so far as to claim that the spirit of Katie King had gotten into bed at her home with her and her husband. So yeah, there was definitely an erotic appeal to these, as well as the sort of more spiritual side of them.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a question about this I'm going to read a paragraph from your book, and I think it's fascinating. There are 3 just amazing statements in this one paragraph, and I don't even know what to ask about it, but it just blew my mind. So, who was Harding? You were talking about Harding?
Emma Harding, yeah. It's a little confusing because she went through a couple of name changes due to marriages and so forth, but she was a writer who was one of the principal chroniclers of the whole spiritualist movement. She wrote a couple of books that were just immense and were kind of ended up being the spiritualist Bibles in some ways.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that. You say Harding also notes that spiritualists made the bravest of soldiers because of their total unconcern on the subject of death, and affirms that mediums saved the lives of many on the battlefield. Harding also suggested that spiritualists have common ground with newly freed African Americans, many who see spirits, foretell events, and recognize influences. She recounts a discussion between a Union lieutenant and an elderly slave in which the latter talks of how many former slaves saw visions that prophesied the coming war. I mean, first of all, that paragraph was just amazing. I mean, I learned so much just from that one paragraph. Spiritualists made the bravest of soldiers because of their unconcern for death. And also, like, mediums saved the lives of many on the battlefield. Talk about that. What did that mean?
Well, she's writing, of course, in response to the Civil War. And I think you have to look at that as being somewhat colored by her beliefs. The idea that mediums were saving the lives of people on the battlefield, for example, is probably a little bit of an exaggeration, to put it mildly. But I'm also not sure I would buy that the young spiritualist soldiers didn't care about death. But again, it was something that probably gave some comfort to people. Obviously, the losses in the Civil War were so catastrophic. And one of the things that gave spiritualism a huge boost in the U.S. was the Civil War, because people not only lost their young sons or their young husbands or their brothers in this battle, but quite often they didn't even know what had happened to them. They didn't know if they were dead, if they'd been captured, if they had run off to the West, whatever. So seeing a medium could give someone immense comfort in that respect. The medium would tell them, oh, your son is dead, but he says it's fine. He didn't feel pain. He loves you. I mean, obviously that was very comforting to a lot of people. This notion that mediums were saving the lives had something to do with, I think, her belief that there was even suggestions that mediums were in contact with spirits who were telling them, revealing details about upcoming battles. That obviously runs throughout all of history, because we can see that way back in the classical world. So again, I'm not sure I'm quite buying that from her. What's interesting to me there is the note about the Union soldier and the elderly slave. I find that interesting because one of the things that was really interesting about that late 19th century spiritualist movement was that they were very liberal and progressive. Many of them were abolitionists. That went hand in hand with spiritualist beliefs quite often. And even in the early days, right at the beginning of spiritualism with the Fox sisters. The Fox sisters were up in Rochester, New York, which was also one of the homes of the early abolition movement. And of all people, Frederick Douglass was a fan of the Fox sisters. So there was always this interesting sort of parallel thing going on with spiritualism and abolitionism. And then later on, the anti-vivisectionist movement was aligned with spiritualism. That was a big thing, especially in Britain. And you also get a lot of crossover with suffragettes and the women's rights movement and workers' rights, especially again in Britain, where the conditions for the average worker in a factory, for example, were quite poor. And that was something that concerned spiritualists.
Yeah, and I didn't even think until you said it, the spiritualists made the bravest of soldiers. I didn't think of that in a way that was meant to comfort the living about feeling better about all of the death that had come from the war. Interesting.
There's a really interesting story about that from World War I. There's a very famous book that came out of World War I called Raymond. And it's a book about a fairly well-known man his son has died in World War I, and he's absolutely devastated, but he starts getting spiritual messages from his dead son. And he detailed it in this book. And the book is really, really heartrending. And you can see why it became a gigantic, immense bestseller and why it gave comfort to so many people, because, again, the losses were devastating in World War I, with so many people losing their young sons on these battlefields.
There's so many things I haven't even touched on, and so people need to check the book out for sure. And you were kind enough to give me a PDF of your book because the book's not out, but I have a Dead Tree version ordered and on the way. So just know that it'll be waiting for the shelving ceremony. You have a chapter that I haven't gotten to yet called the something about the modern seance. Or if we even do we need the seance, or?
Those are actually two different chapters.
Okay.
The modern seance is, I think, the penultimate chapter where I have a sort of theory about what happened with spiritualism. I think it kind of split into two different channels in the mid and later 20th century. I think the sort of spiritualist obsession with scientifically proving that this was happening went off and became our modern paranormal investigation. And I think the sort of more spiritualist side, with the mediums conveying messages from dead loved ones and so forth, became our modern psychics, the John Edwards and George Andersons and so forth. And the last chapter in the book is one where I just kind of dove into why do we have this obsession with believing in this and investigating it and so forth that's run throughout all of human history.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And of course, I have liked calling anything that I do, with this podcast, I like calling it a seance. Anytime I'm questioning something, I like to call it a seance. When I go and investigate a home or whatever, or do an EVP session, or sit down in a Ouija board, or even talk to people about their experiences and ghost stories, to me, that's all. I like to think of it as all one umbrella, a seance. Maybe that's just, I'm biased because the name of my show is The Big Seance. Whatever.
I think that's perfectly fine, because that word has been applied to a lot of different things. Before, it was applied to the act of gathering a group of people around a table to call forth spirits. It was applied to it actually just means, the original French word just refers to a large gathering. And it used to refer to political gatherings. And then it started to refer to, before spiritualism, mesmerism was a big thing. And they would call gatherings of mesmerist seances. So, hey, use it.
Cool. I have permission. I am going to do that. You are a Halloween expert. And I have read several of your books on Halloween, and I've wanted to interview you I still am going to have to get you back on here just to talk about Halloween one of these days. But I happen to know a lot of Halloween nerds out there that are a little anxious about what our upcoming Halloween will be in the middle of this pandemic. And it makes me wonder if we are in for some permanent changes to what Halloween of the future might be because of this pandemic. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm definitely in the camp of those Halloween nerds who are concerned. It is, of course, particularly disappointing because this year it was on a Saturday. It was a full moon.
Yes.
I mean, it should have been incredible. And at this point, I follow a local haunters group on Facebook. Obviously, I live in Southern California where there are a lot of really dedicated home haunters because we're right next to the amusement parks and in the middle of the entertainment industry. And so people put on some fairly extraordinary home haunts around here. And I've been seeing people are doing everything from canceling their haunts to redesigning them this year. I put on just a small yard display that I enjoy doing, and we are reconfiguring it this year, figuring that we can't actually walk people up to the house, but we still want to give families and their kids something fun. So we're designing it to be seen more from the street. And I think a lot of people are doing that in terms of trick or treat and whether it will have a long-term effect. I doubt it very much that it will have a long-term effect, because I look back at something like 9/11. And after 9/11, which happened obviously somewhat close to Halloween, that year people predicted that Halloween would be devastated by 9/11, and it was not. It was actually bigger than ever that year. One of the reasons being that all the kids wanted to dress up as firemen and policemen and first responders and so forth. And that tradition actually made Halloween even bigger. I think it emerged from 9/11 bigger than ever. So I don't think this is going to permanently damage the holiday. I certainly hope not, of course, but it may have some long-lasting changes. It may be that more people will do what we're doing, move their displays in a more street-friendly fashion and less of a maze sort of thing where you're very confined and close together. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
I had to tell you a story about last Halloween, which I was actually very ashamed. I am a huge Halloween nerd, and I get so upset when Halloween doesn't go like I want it to, or if the weather's bad or whatever. And last year I was really not feeling it, and I was really bummed, and I was not in the Halloween spirit, and I didn't even decorate my house, which is a first. And, I was busy and stressed, and it was really cold here in Missouri that Halloween. And one thing we did, and it actually ended up being very funny, and we have I made a video of all the different responses, but we used our doorbell camera and greeted our trick-or-treaters that way and talked to them and asked them questions about their costumes and told them how much candy they could get. And we even got some people coming back trying to fake us out because, of course, we weren't at the front door. We were, behind the camera. So they'd come back and we'd be like, hey, weren't you here before? And then they'd make a joke about how, it wasn't really, it was just somebody else with the same. It was hilarious. And so I'm like, man, maybe we should have just saved that for this year, for this coming Halloween. But that was a different look at Halloween for me. I was ashamed of it. But then I was like, could this be some kind of futuristic way of trick-or-treating? And
yeah, it might. I mean, that makes perfect sense this year.
It was, I don't know, we might have to consider doing it again, but I can't be in a funk again this year. I won't let myself do that. I can't ruin another Halloween.
I feel like this year it's particularly important to not be in a funk at Halloween.
Well, and it makes me think of how people were putting their Christmas trees up again this summer, which, first of all, I couldn't imagine dragging all the Christmas stuff back up for this summer. But there are plenty of people that would probably be totally in for making Halloween all year round.
I don't know anybody like that.
As I'm looking at Lisa's back wall that you can't see with Halloween art all over, it's beautiful. It's lovely. So, Lisa, tell us, any final thoughts that you might have, because I haven't even gotten to a lot of the second half of the book. I'm guilty of that. And so we might not have hit on that, but any final thoughts you have where we can find you, where we can find the book, and anything else you want to say?
I will take advantage of this to shamelessly self-promote. I actually have 3 books coming out this fall. The first one will be out next month, and it's called Weird Women, Classic Supernatural Fiction by Groundbreaking Female Writers, 1852 to 1923. It's a collection of stories by early women horror writers that is incredible. I'm really proud of it. I co-edited it with my friend Leslie Klinger, who is an esteemed anthologist and annotator. I can tell you that we're already getting some really rave reviews that I'm not supposed to talk about yet. It will be coming out around the time of the book's release. And so that'll be out in August. And then in September, I will have both Calling the Spirits out and a collection of my own short fiction called Night Terrors and Other Stories. So it'll be a busy fall for me.
Awesome. And lisamorton.com is your main website, correct?
Right, sure.
Awesome. Well, you rock. Thank you so much for being on the show and talking about subjects that are the most popular for listeners of this podcast. And so we definitely have to have you back on to talk about Halloween and other things as well.
Oh, I could do that totally.
I look forward to it.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you to the following super paranerds who support the show at patreon.com/Big Seance. James Deacon, Melissa Armour, Anne Marie Sullivan, Justin J. Justin, Genesis, Natalie, Kim Robb, Jim Budd, Josiel Lorenzo, Susan Davey, Paula Mitchell, and Amy Park Gedicke. My supporters at the Parlor Guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Linda of shimmeringmoons.com, Denise Sia of Mystic Moms Paranormal, Anne Rekovich of ozparatech.com. Here's a new one. Gretchen of Adirondack Aromatherapy, Cassie Keller, David Rubenstein, Glenna Becker, Diane Rax, Nettie, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Peggy Hagen, Marion Hover Clairvoyant, Bruce Williams, Lana and John of Carbon Lilies, and Norman and Linda Keller. That sound you just heard was the Above and Beyond There's Not Even a Category for Your Level of Support fireworks display, because I have 4 awesome listeners who support the show at the $10 level. Those people are awesome people like Steve Skinner, Kevin Gilbert, AJ Meredith, and James Wilfong. So thank you, Steve, Kevin, AJ, and James, and thank you, Paranerds. Peace out.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. You can find and subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and just about anywhere podcasts are found. Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show. Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to bigseance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.
Yeah. And really, didn't it, could it have involved sacrifice?